On the afternoon of July 3, 1863, a man rode a black horse into a wall of fire and never came out. 12,500 men stepped into the open ground between Seminary Ridge and the low stone wall of the Union Center. 2/3 of them never made it back. But among the thousands of fallen, one disappearance remains singular, haunting, and absolute. 0. That is the number of witnesses who could definitively say where Richard Brooke Garnett fell or what happened to his body in the chaotic red wake of the charge. He didn't just die. He was erased from the physical record of the world. To understand the disappearance, you have to understand the man who rode out that day. Richard Brooke Garnett was the quintessential product of the old guard. 50 years old in the summer of 1863, his entire identity was forged in the furnace of the United States Army. West Point class of 1841, a legendary year that produced William Tecumseh Sherman and Richard Eel. Garnett spent 20 years in the saddle, patrolling the deadly frontiers of Kansas and the Pacific Northwest. He was a professional soldier who understood the weight of command and the absolute non-negotiable value of a man's reputation. When Virginia seceded, Garnett faced the same impossible choice as his peers. He resigned his commission in May of 1861, walking away from 2 decades of service. He was quickly promoted to brigadier general and given what should have been the most prestigious assignment in the South, command of the Stonewall Brigade. Thomas Stonewall Jackson had turned this unit into a legend, but for Garnett, it was the beginning of a nightmare. This is where we see the first recurrence of a theme that would define his end, the lone voice of reason ignored by the machine of war. In March of 1862, at the Battle of Kernstown, Garnett found himself in an untenable position. His men had been fighting for hours. Their ammunition was gone. The Union line was surging forward, threatening to swallow his entire brigade. Garnett made a tactical decision. He ordered a withdrawal to save his men from total annihilation. To any modern observer, it was a sound military judgment. To Stonewall Jackson, it was a moral failure. Jackson was not a man of nuance. He believed a commander should hold his ground until he was either victorious or dead. He arrested Garnett the following day, filing formal charges of neglect of duty and conduct prejudicial to good order. In the honor-bound culture of the Confederate officer corps, this was a death sentence delivered by ink and paper. A man accused of cowardice by the most famous hero in the South. For the next year, he lived as a pariah, a general without a command. A man whose very presence in a room caused other officers to look at the floor. He begged for a court-martial. He needed a formal verdict to clear his name, but the war moved too fast for the law. Battles kept pushing the trial back. Then, in May of 1863, Stonewall Jackson was shot by his own men at Chancellorsville. He died days later, and with him died any chance Garnett had for a formal clearing of his record. The charges weren't dismissed, they were simply left to hang in the air, unresolved. Garnett was back in command, now leading a brigade under George Pickett, but he was a man living in the shadow of an unanswered question. He needed to prove his courage in a way that no one, not even the ghost of Stonewall Jackson, could ever challenge again. Gettysburg was that opportunity. By the time the Army of Northern Virginia moved into Pennsylvania, Garnett was suffering from a debilitating injury to his leg, likely a kick from a horse. He couldn't walk without agony. Under normal circumstances, an infantry general leads his men on foot. You stay low. You minimize the target you present to the enemy. But Garnett couldn't walk. If he was going to lead his men into the assault Lee had ordered on the 3rd day, he would have to ride. Consider the math of that decision. A man on horseback during an infantry charge is not a leader. He is a lighthouse for every rifleman and artillery officer on the opposing ridge. He sits 6 feet above the infantry. His fellow officers saw the numbers. They begged him to stay behind, or at least remain at the rear. Garnett refused. He wasn't just leading a brigade, he was hunting for a way to kill a rumor. He donned an old blue overcoat, a strange, heavy choice for a sweltering July day. Some historians suggest it was a remnant of his old U.S. Army uniform, a silent nod to the life he had before the world went mad. Others say he simply wanted to be as visible as possible. He wanted there to be no mistake about who was riding toward the Union line. He climbed into the saddle of his black horse, a figure in dark blue among a sea of gray and butternut, and prepared to answer the question Jackson had posed a year earlier. At 1 p.m., the silence of Pennsylvania was shattered by the largest artillery bombardment the continent had ever seen. 150 Confederate guns opened fire. It failed. When the long lines of Pickett's division stepped out of the tree line, the Union guns were waiting. Garnett's brigade moved on the right. They walked at first, a slow, rhythmic advance like a funeral procession. Then the pace quickened. The Union artillery switched from long-range shells to canister. Imagine a giant shotgun filled with iron marbles. That is what was hitting the Confederate line every few seconds. Men were not just wounded, they were obliterated. Garnett didn't flinch. He stayed elevated. He stayed conspicuous. A Union officer with binoculars noted a lone Confederate general on a black horse moving steadily through the smoke, seemingly immune to the lead storm. His own men saw him waving his sword, shouting orders, urging the brigade towards the angle, the slight jog in the stone wall where the Union line was most concentrated. This was where the world would end for Richard Garnett. He reached the vicinity of the wall, a place where the air was thick with burnt powder and the screams of 10,000 dying men. And then the record goes dark. When the charge collapsed and the survivors staggered back to Seminary Ridge, Richard Garnett was gone. Not among the wounded, not among the prisoners listed in Union ledgers. He simply ceased to exist. In the days following the battle, his staff officers scoured the field. They wrote letters to the Union command under flags of truce. They interviewed every man who had been near the stone wall. They found nothing. What they found instead was a landscape of carnage on a scale the human mind isn't built to process. 51,000 casualties across 3 days. The fields in front of the stone wall were covered in layers of the dead, bloated by the July heat. Union burial parties, overwhelmed by the stench and the sheer volume of corpses, worked with grim, hurried efficiency. Officers were usually identified and given separate markers. Enlisted men were rolled into mass trenches. No body matching the description of a middle-aged man in a blue overcoat was ever identified. This leads to the most chilling possibility. A direct hit from an artillery shell at close range doesn't just kill a man, it unmakes him. It is possible that Richard Garnett was simply obliterated, his physical presence scattered across the soil he was trying to conquer. It is also possible he was stripped of his boots and his blue coat by desperate scavengers, his naked body tossed into a nameless trench with the boys he led to their deaths. The only physical fragment of his existence to surface was a sword discovered in a Baltimore pawn shop 20 years after the war. It was a standard cavalry sword with markings consistent with an officer of Garnett's rank. It is believed to be his. It cannot be proven to be his. The sword had been sold for a pittance by someone who didn't know or didn't care that it was the only remaining testament to a man's life. A sword is not a man. A sword does not tell you where its owner fell or whether there was anything left of him when it was done. Today, if you visit Hollywood Crematory in Richmond, you will find a marker for him. It is a memorial, not a grave. A placeholder for a body that was never found. His life had been defined by a separation, his reputation severed from his record by Stonewall Jackson's accusation.
Even his death could not stay whole. He remains the ghost of the high watermark, a reminder that in the accounting of war, sometimes the most prominent figures are the ones the earth refuses to give back. What do you think? Did Garnett find the vindication he was looking for at the stone wall, or was his death just another unnecessary statistic in a war full of them? Let me know in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.